I'm Fedor Holz, and I welcome you to the Perspectives podcast with my today's guest, Daniel Schmachtenberger. He has done work in functional medicine, in biotech, in education, and in human development, and advised private and public sector leaders on how to address complex scenarios across a number of fields. His central interest is long-term civilization design, and I'm super excited to hear more about his perspectives. Hey everyone, I'm really excited to launch my first episode of my first ever podcast. And I couldn't be happier to have my guest today, who is Daniel Schmachtenberger. Very easy for me to say his name because it's a German version, probably more difficult for Americans. I'm actually very excited that you're my first guest, Daniel, because I remember our first encounter in San Diego 1.5 years ago. We just talked about it. And this was one of the most inspiring conversations that I've had in the last years. And it was mostly because of your different way to think about the world and the things that you care about and that you're driven by to change in this world. And so I'm really excited to explore more of your perspective today and be able to pick your brain and hopefully share some value with other people in the audience. So thanks for being with us.
It's an honor to get to be on your first podcast.
So actually I want to start in right away with, we already mapped out some topics or the most interesting topics. And one thing that immediately stood out to me was the topic of perspectives and perspective seeking. So, Danny, I have a very personal question as well. Like, what's your perspective seeking approach? Like, how do you come to believe what you're believing right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason that this came up as we were starting to dialogue was you said that you were thinking of calling the podcast Perspectives. And yes. I said it feels valuable, since that's a deep central theme to what you want to do here, to actually explore that topic itself. So if you don't mind me switching roles for a minute, why did you want to do a podcast on perspectives?
Oh, I love that. So personally, because I just go by feeling. And I remember this feeling very distinctively. I've talked oftentimes, I've shared your content oftentimes with people. Your podcast, on Forward Thinkers is probably one of the podcasts I shared the most in the past. And I get this trickling feeling of excitement when I hear something that I feel is growing me, is challenging me, is expanding my perspective, because it's changing my experience, how I interact with my environment. And I feel it in a way where I feel more positive about the way I engage with my environment. And that's why I'm so excited to hear different perspectives, and also in that process, I'm learning with every new perspective that I hear, that I experience, I realize something that is, I think I consider the path, my personal path of consciousness is, I'm realizing that it's not only me. My perspective is not the only relevant one, is not the only right one. And the more I experience that, I feel the healthier I live, the happier I am. And so that's why I care so much about perspectives and exploring perspectives.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you say you feel happier as you're exposed to more perspectives, even if they're ones that might invalidate previous views you had, or at least show the inadequacy of them, is a really healthy psychological orientation. Because if every time you realize that your previous best understanding of the world was really inadequate, you feel badly, then it will end up having you want to do confirmation bias and look for things that confirm what you currently think. And that's going to limit the scope of obviously what you can understand about reality and how effective you can be in acting on it. So there's there's an epistemic drive, right? Epistemology meaning how do we go about knowing stuff? There's an epistemic drive that can have its own incentive, where there is a, like you mentioned, like a joy or an aliveness just from coming to understand something better. And when that becomes stronger than whatever kind of fragile identity structure wants to be seen as already having it figured out, then the rate of learning obviously goes up quite a lot. And so I'm happy for us to start by exploring the topic of perspective, because we would be, whatever other topic we were exploring, we'd be exploring it through perspectives. So it's valuable to look at the process by which we look, right? Perspective, even though the word is from optical science, is looking at the world. And the key kind of insight, the first insight, is that when I'm looking at something and I have a perspective on it, it's not what I'm seeing is not actually the thing. Because if I went to the other side, I would see something else. And if I zoomed in with a microscope, or if I looked in the ultraviolet spectrum or with a radio telescope, or I would see something else, right? So I'm getting a perspective. I'm getting some bandwidth of light bouncing off of one side of something with some error or whatever coming and a certain resolution into my eyes. And so one very valuable insight is that perspective, in the process of perceiving something, inherently reduces the total information of the thing. So my perspective on something is never actually the thing, right? And I need to take many different perspectives to even start to get a sense. So of course, if I'm looking at a building from the west side or the east side or the north side, or from an aerial view, or inside one room or inside another room, they're all true and they're all partial. And if I tried to hold it as if, well, which one is it? That would make no sense, because it's not a 2D object, right? It's this very complex 3D object with internal structure. And so they're all true, they're all partial. But if I'm trying to collapse a complex 3D thing to 2D, right, to a single perspective that I can take a picture of, it's just going to be wrong. It'll have some truth value in it, but to the degree that I think it's adequate, it'll be a whole dimension wrong, which is infinitely wrong, right? There's a whole infinity of another dimension missing. And we do this with our perspective on social topics or other people or the nature of reality all the time. And so then even if I take all of the pictures and I say, okay, I'm going to take as many pictures as I can. And of course, I can never show that I took every perspective on it. Maybe I didn't get under the table and have a look at what maybe a kid sees in their view of the house. Their main memory might be that view from under the table when they think of the house, right? Or whatever, I missed the aerial view. So that's one thing, is that you can never show closure over the perspective space. I won't say never. For the most part, in reality, you can never show closure over the perspective space. And then even if I take a lot of the pictures, and it's a pretty good representation, I put them in as a collage in 2D, that's still not what the house looks like, because it's still not 2D. So then I could sew them together into a video, and I take a video tour of the house, right? Well, I still don't see the whole thing at once, but I added another dimension back in now, which is time, right? The video is showing over time. So I have 2D, and then I have the connection of all these 2D images through the flow of time. And now I'm back at the right kind of dimensionality. And so I can get a sense of, a more adequate kind of sense of. So when I was fairly young, I noticed that when people were arguing about political topics or philosophic topics, that there was usually a dialectical kind of thing going on, where there was some truth value and some inadequacy to explain all of the other truth values, but they were seeing the west side of the house or the east side, and they were overemphasizing the part that felt most real and meaningful to them based on the perspective of the reality they had. And so how to be able to seek to see through the other perspectives, and then seek not higher perspective, because you don't get higher perspective, right? How do you seek a higher trans-perspective synthesis? This is something that, like, this is philosophy 101, right? This is the Hegelian dialectic. What is take a particular view on something and postulate it, and you have a thesis. And then find something that seems like almost the exact opposite view, but that some people believe in, and you have an antithesis. Those will usually be at a similar level of complexity. right? Similar number. If I tried to express the view under maximum information compression, it'd be similar-ish. And so this can look like the debates that you see around capitalism and communism, or similarly around the Democratic or Republican or generally left or right kind of political platforms, which can often be thought of as having to do with more emphasis on the collective and the whole, or more emphasis on the individual, right? Rights and responsibilities, various things like that. But they actually don't, it's not that there is kind of a gradient with 0 and negative and positive numbers, and you find the right place between rights and responsibilities. It's that there's actually perpendicular axes, and that you can increase rights and responsibilities at the same time, but it's in a higher dimensional space, right? You kind of have to get that higher dimensionality right. Otherwise, people will default to thinking the thing that they really care about is being automatically threatened, right? Their perspective also encodes a value. There is something that they value within that thing, that perspective. And then they might kind of vehemently oppose or not want to hear another perspective, because it seems like if that one is held as true, it's this one is true or that one is true. And if that one's held as true, then it will invalidate the value here. As opposed to the synthesis is actually a higher order of complexity. Under maximum compression of the good statement of it, there would be more total bits required. And it'll end up including the true parts of each of these and how they relate, what the nature of the feedback cycles with a higher perspective. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but the synthesis is not of the same type, right? It is a includes and transcends type function. Now, I must say there's a lot of people who hate Hegelian dialectics, because particularly there's a lot of kind of empirically or Popperian oriented people, because a dialectic has been abused as a tool for manipulation. But it's like every tool can be weaponized, right? So the fact that I can beat somebody to death with a hammer doesn't mean a hammer has no legitimate purpose and that we should always be wary of everyone with hammers. It means pick any tool in my house and I could make a weapon out of it if you wanted, right? And similarly, pick any intellectual tool and I can make a weapon out of it. I can use the principles of critical thinking as a way to just be an asshole and tell everyone that they're in logical fallacy all the time. So Hegelian dialectic has been weaponized to say, okay, what is the conclusion I want the other person to come to, whether it's true or not, for my own game theoretic purposes? I'll phrase that as a synthesis, and then I will reverse engineer a thesis and an antithesis, both of which will have little errors hidden, but I'll use principles of rhetoric, and I'll frame it up that there's some truth here, there's some truth here, and the synthesis is obviously true. So that weapon has been used all the time. But that doesn't mean the tool is not actually valid. So it has to do with what is the intent and the capacity of the use of the intellectual tool. Now, the last part there is it's not always thesis and antithesis. It might be lots of different perspectives, right? There might be lots of different insights around a thing going on. And how do we factor all of those to be able to inform both our understanding of the world and where we have collective choice making to engage in? Because whether we build a utility or a road isn't an individual choice only. It's like those are things that we engage in. And so whether we do that through a democratic process or a meritocratic process or whatever, all of our social systems are systems for how do we collectively figure out how to coordinate things bigger than individuals can do on their own. And that does involve coordinating how we're sense-making the world and coordinating what we think is valuable. And so my ability to actually perceive what is valuable to you and how you're making sense of the world without it seeming like a threat to my own. And then be able to see, are there higher order frames that can take what you value and what I value and what you're seeing is true and what I'm seeing is true, correct the distortions either of us have, and be able to offer better insights forward than had been there previously.
I really like that take. And specifically two things that I'd like to summarize that stood out to me is, I think on the first statement that every perspective has truth in some part, and the second that the partiality of it, that it's always just true as a part of a bigger picture, or it's one truth that is a part of a bigger picture. And I think this the more we try to force or reduce this partiality and say like, okay, no, my truth is the only truth, or is the biggest part, the most relevant part, and reduce the dimensionality and say, okay, there's like, it can only be my truth or your truth. I think then that's a good transition to talk about sense making, right? Because once we've established that, it's like, hey, every perspective has truth, right? And it's a part of a bigger picture. Now it's about what you said in your last sentence is, okay, wait a second, how can we make more sense of that? Because if all perspectives are relevant, we need to understand all these perspectives, and we need to listen, and we need to find consensus to make sure that we can proceed and progress and develop into a higher stage of human consciousness as well, or consensus. So what's your take on sense making, the status we are in right now as a society on a global level, and what do you see as the most relevant parts right now to focus on? Big topic.
So there's some tools we need to construct together first.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about the partiality or the believed completeness of a view, there's a very deep topic that comes up, which is a person's relationship with the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. And because a lot of people who have the sense that their view is pretty complete don't have a very deep relationship with the unknowable and with the extent of the category that is the unknown unknowns, right? And so they don't realize that everything they know can be represented in a finite number of bits, and usually a relatively small finite number of bits, and the totality of reality via Tarski's theorem or Gödel's theorem or whatever is fundamentally infinite. And so they know no fraction, right? Mathematically represented fraction. And so
you know nothing, basically,
as a fraction of all that is. And so this leads to certainty bias. And this is one of the things I became dubious of early, because as someone who was very interested in learning, when I was pretty young, I would learn things and I'd get excited. And then I'd realize that I knew more about a topic than some people around me. And then I get over certain that I understood the topic. And then I would learn more and I'd be like, oh shit, there's like whole universes around this I didn't even know I was unaware of, right? Like when people start learning math, and the most advanced thing they've ever heard about when they're a kid is calculus. They don't know the whole universe of shit beyond calculus that they aren't factoring. So by the time they're in 8th grade, they think they're getting pretty close to knowing all of math, right? And that's the case in most any field, including understanding reality, which includes new fields all the time. And so one of the things that happened for me was I started getting really embarrassed about the things that I had been sure about that then I became completely clear were wrong. And not wanting to do that thing a bunch, right? And that started to temper the relationship to premature certainty. And then I found it very interesting to study history and look at how many things that humans believed so fervently that they would die in war for the belief, or they would kill other humans for the belief, that all seem ludicrous to us now, like pretty much all of it. And how easy it is for us to see where previous people were wrong about what they were certain of, that had the genetically same brains as us. And how easy it is for us to sense that someone else is completely wrong about something that they're very deeply certain of, but that nobody can actually think of a single belief that they currently hold that they think they're wrong about. And yet they're probably wrong about almost everything. And that's a really disastrous human condition, because those wrong beliefs inform action. And so if I'm continuously navigating on a map that's not true, I'll be driving into cliffs and shit, right? Like, it's important that I calibrate my map, especially as I want to do more significant action. For most people, it doesn't matter that much because the scope of what they're trying to do allows their ignorance to not be hitting them in the face all the time. Now, it's very easy to overcompensate in the other direction and to say, okay, any time that anyone has ever been certain, it was unwarranted. And there are actually no absolute truths, therefore there's no even relative higher truth claim. Everything is just perspective. And anyone who claims that something has more validity is somewhere between immature and an imperialist. And that's kind of the direction that a lot of the postmodern movement of thinking went, right? But this is also gibberish, because we will be acting in the world and we'll be acting on some information, and it's not equally good information. And some things make rocket ships work and some things don't make rocket ships work. And we can be pretty empirically clear about whether a technology works based on our understanding of it or not. And if we have to treat a viral condition or make decisions regarding policy or whatever, it actually really fucking matters that we are getting things right regarding this, right? And so this is what we've tried to develop, things like the scientific method and the various domains of science and those types of epistemic tools for. But we also start to get quickly into the place that the way we think about science formally is a method that can be applied to the domain of things that are both measurable and repeatable. Well, there are things that are real that are not measurable, like every experience you've ever had. I can measure what's happening in your brain in some very narrow dimension. It's pretty hard to do an fMRI and a QEEG and whatever on you at the same time, because they're interaffecting each other, and all of that still only gives me a tiny bit of the total insight, right? But I can't measure your experience. I can't do a third-person process on first person. And there's also lots of real stuff that is measurable but not repeatable, like all novel phenomena. And so then I can try and do statistics, but then that's not quite science, right? So we start to realize that science is necessary but not sufficient to understand the nature of reality. So then the question is, what are the right methods? What are the right epistemics to go about coming up with the confidence margin? And what confidence do I need to inform what kind of action based on how consequential the action is and based on how consequential non-acting is? And so this is now getting us into sense making, but I can't sense make well if I have a bias towards wanting more certainty than I really have the right foundation for, or I have a bias towards being uncomfortable with any certainty and wanting to continue to dwell within uncertainty and multi-perspective process without actually integrating them. And so this is an interesting place where, like, emotional biases and existential and identity biases end up affecting cognitive biases. And yet perspective taking is connected to all of it, which is why I really like the name of the podcast and why I thought it's an interesting topic. Is when I'm doing repeatability in science, that's actually a perspective process. I'm wanting to make sure that this particular thing that I'm holding as objective is true across all of these perspectives that hold the same context, right? Mm-hmm. That it's not subjective or intersubjective, it's objective. Obviously, science doesn't give me how to do governance, because governance has a lot of first person and second person stuff, right? Like mostly all of it, but it's informed by third person. So there I have to do perspective seeking of like it's so easy, like in the US right now, especially politically, it's so easy to take a whole group of people on the other side of the political spectrum and just throw them all out as bad and dumb. And both sides do it kind of equally well. And without even being able to empathize with why they seem bad and dumb to the other side, or why the other side could actually see anything that way. Now, when you ask what are the source of the problems, this is one of the source of the problems. And this creates radically inefficient government. This creates war. This creates poor coordination and poor shared sense making. This creates super inefficiently utilized resource. It's also why the divorce rate is so high and why people have shitty relationships at the micro level. When I used to do relationship counseling with people, one of the things, which was everyone should be a relationship counselor for a little while in your life, because there's so much when you watch other people doing it is so obvious and so dreadful, and then you realize that you did that, and then you're ashamed to ever do that again, and it helps. But typically, this pattern that I would see again and again was that the couple would sit down, and in her version of the story, it's so clear how things would be better if he did stuff differently. She's tried all the things that she can try, and she can't make it better, which is why she's frustrated and she's there, because obviously he has to. And in his version of the story, things would be better if she did stuff differently. And this is why they're on their path to divorce. And all that can do, because they're not perspective taking, right? So all that can do is make them resent each other and feel powerless. And then to the extent that they feel powerless and the other person has to change, trying to control the other person is the best thing they could possibly do. And this is actually another important point when you wanted to start coming back to the world, is if we can't sense make even what the experience of the people closest to us is and can't resolve those conflicts, we're so not qualified to be able to help Israel and Palestine or the US and China, or like, it's important to realize that those personal experiences are a training ground to get very basic capacities, because the larger issues are still just human issues multiplied by a lot of scale. And so one of the things I started doing was to just speed it up, because I was tired of the process where she would tell her side of the story and he'd be shaking his head the whole time, and he still wouldn't get it. And then he'd tell his side of the story and she'd be crying, feeling so unseen and misunderstood and whatever. And so I just stopped them in the beginning and be like, look, I know you both know your own side of the story, so I don't want you to tell it to me. I want you to tell the other person's side of the story from the beginning, right? So husband, tell me why she's upset, what she perceives, what she would like to be different. Before you do, I want you to tell me how good you think you're going to do at this. Like, how well do you think you probably understand it? And then I do the same thing. And what was interesting was they never did a good job. If they did, they wouldn't have those problems. But they always thought they would do a better job than they did.
Certainly.
So not only did they do a bad job of understanding each other, but they didn't even realize how badly they didn't understand each other, right? Because it was an unknown class that they weren't even recognizing.
But I think it all comes down to the topic of certainty then, where it's like how certain I am in what I believe to be true, and how open, and then at the other side, how open am I to look at things that are outside of what I believe to be true, to change what I believe to be true.
Well, the certainty is an important part, which is why I brought it up. One can have certainty that what I think has some value without having certainty that it's close to complete. And this is why it's so important to recognize the unknown class, not just the shit that I know that I'm unaware of, but that there might be shit that I am not even imagining that changes my sense making completely.
But the most difficult part I struggle with is, okay, what you mentioned before is I perceive humans to be mostly relative thinkers. It's like, okay, I have this thing that I compare myself or my view or my idea to. And so now, okay, I'm looking at the unknown. I'm looking at all the potential things that could be there, will be there. And now, as you said before, it feels infinite. And how do I compare my limited my limited understanding to something that is infinitely hard to understand for me? Like this part I constantly struggle with. And when you said like, okay, sense making, a part of that is certainty. Like, how do I ever can say is like, oh, I'm that and this certain about this and this like this and this viewpoint or this and this action. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so this is great because you just entered the domain of religion, which is what types of certainty can we have or not in the domain of what we would call the infinite or total reality or something like that. And you can see with regard to the certainty bias that there's a lot of people who feel absolutely certain that they know the nature of ultimate reality all the way to how the universe was created and how it will end and what God's name is. And it's like, wow, you're that certain about all that shit. And then you see another, what I would say is a more mature relationship to that same impulse, which the mystics in all of the religions talked about the great unknowable, but that they can have some sensed relationship with. And so the first verse of the Tao Te Ching, you think about this, it's like, okay, so Lao Tzu is going to take all of his wisdom, write it down in this set of verses. The very first verse says, the Tao that is knowable is not the eternal Tao. Right?
What's your interpretation of that?
Well, the knowable is finite. Okay. And so what he's saying is the knowledge that's knowable is not the eternal knowledge. The Tao that is nameable, that is finite, is not the whole thing. So the nameable, the finitely describable, is the beginning of the great confusion, right? So a lot of people reflect on that and they get that. Okay, so I'm never going to actually have complete understanding of ultimate reality. But then the next part to get is that he still then went on to do a bunch more verses, wrote a whole book of words that were not useless, right? Which is, don't think that you have absolute certainty of the whole, but don't think that it's not worth gaining relatively increased insight also.
Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, it's difficult to... I don't feel like we start at that point of we know nothing and we can relatively increase our knowledge. I feel it's more like we feel like we know 40%, and with every experience we decrease that percentage by realizing, oh, actually, maybe I didn't know that much. So I feel these are two different experiences.
This is that Dunning-Kruger curve, right? And so there's this beautiful process that as we go on learning more in life, we both know actually more and have less total certainty and recognize what a tinier percentage it is. And those people are ultimately more trustworthy.
And more curious and more open-minded probably, and more empathic. And I mean, I find it interesting because when I look at that, I feel all these subparts that we can look at is like, I want to listen. I want to be a good listener. I want to be a trustworthy, honest. Like all these things are kind of results of that process. At least that's how it seems to me.
So this was an interesting thing I was thinking about a moment ago. So in the field of developmental psychology, where you're looking at like Piaget's working on how children develop through different discrete stages, where they don't have language and then they do, and they don't have abstract reasoning, they do. There's no reason to think that the development of human capacity stops around 18 or puberty or whatever.
So then that's it.
What are the higher stages of development that humans can continue to go to is this whole very interesting field of psychology, developmental psych. And it kind of is also what all of the religions and philosophical and self-development traditions focused on, which is what does the development of a human being, what are the upper bounds of its potential? What is actually a meaningful human life? And what are the practices and processes to get there? And whether you're looking at like the ethical line of development, someone increasing their kind of ethical awareness, nuance capacity, or their cognitive, or their domain understanding, or their interpersonal, or their whatever. In the literature on developmental psych, all of the higher stages of development of any of those lines had a lot of correspondence with perspective taking. That as people were able to take more perspectives, they did better in terms of higher stages of especially interpersonal and complex type things. There's a colleague in the integral world, and his name is Clint Fuse, and he did a dissertation that he was telling me about a few years ago that I found very interesting, because he was looking at all this literature deeply on higher stages of human development, what you might call growth in consciousness or enlightenment or abstract kind of terms like that, and looking for what things seem to statistically correlate the most across the literature. And he found this slight refinement, which was that it wasn't perspective taking as a capacity, it was perspective seeking as an orientation. That was kind of the generator function of the development. The development was arising from an impulse to seek more perspectives. Mm-hmm. Whereas someone might have the capacity to do it, but not actually do it very much because there isn't the innate kind of seeking. And so how to actually notice that impulse in you and how to deepen it, and then also notice what makes you turn it off and double down on your own perspective and work with that, will end up being a generator function of taking a lot more perspectives, which means seeing a lot more of the world. Right? As I see the world through a lot more lenses, I get a lot more fucking insight, because something I saw as a kid was I would see a mechanical engineer looking at the world and realizing he was seeing a totally different world than I was seeing. He was looking, like, everywhere he was looking was how stuff was designed and what types of screws and levers and the mechanics and then like a hairstylist was seeing a totally different world, seeing shit I never paid attention to, and a physicist and a chemist and a biologist. And I'm like, I'm not seeing the world. I'm seeing what my relevance filters show me is relevant that I even know to fucking look for. I didn't see the types of screws and levers on everything before, but now that I do, the whole world opened up and I'm getting insights about everything. That's perspective seeking, right? But it's also growth in cognitive insights. It's also increased humility for sure. Recognizing, holy shit, that I just was missing universes, and still am. And then it's also the ability to do much better leadership and governance, because I know that the other people aren't seeing the same world, and yet their worlds are valuable.
And I think that last part is the most important part, is that their view is valuable, and that that I think is a very relevant topic. Also now applying that more to the actual real world situation we're in right now. How can we apply this thought process more to the world we live in right now? How can we establish systems that involve more of that sense making, that deeper sense making, but also that developing into higher stages of consciousness? How? What's your take on that?
So let's say that I'm listening to try to hear the signal in someone as opposed to instantly negatively react to the noise or what I perceive to be the noise. First, what that thing I just said will fix your relationships more than almost anything else, which is if when your partner or your family member, your friend is saying something, if you're listening to try to actually hear what's true in their experience first, and then where you would refine or add or disagree later, like everything will go better. And because they think it's true. And if relationship is, can we actually relate? And if I'm just going into where they're wrong, I'm not relating, which is why the nature of my response then will break the relationship. Now, if I'm listening for what's true in what someone's saying, that doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't also flawed and maybe even catastrophically flawed. But I'll at least understand how to relate with it better, right? So if we look at, you were mentioning, we're in the middle of this kind of COVID global pandemic, and then the systemic fragility we were already in before that, and the fractured information ecology and political divides and tribalism and whatever, and then how those things have been playing out and getting worse under this pressure. So let's say you take a topic that's very divisive, like conspiracy theories. And typically the moment the topic comes up, people have already made up their mind and instantly cleaved. Like, they don't need to hear anymore. They're like, this tinfoil hat wearing motherfucker is a danger to society. How do we shut them up and have them not kill everyone with the plague? Or someone just starts to hear about conspiracy and they're like, yeah, I probably will believe this. I'm probably interested in this. Whoever talks about this are probably my people, right? And what's interesting is there's like an intuitive resonance like that. And it doesn't mean every conspiracy theorist agrees with everything that any particular person says. But so as I overgeneralize to just kind of make a point, and then we can add the nuance back, you can see that that's a very strongly polarizing thing, where then there is basically no perspective seeking across that divide usually that happens. Well, if you ask in abstract, so asking in abstract is helpful because we'll remove all the emotional tension of this situation. So conspiracies have some people shared information with some other people to coordinate for some activity that they don't share widely with everyone for their own personal gain throughout history. Is that a thing that happens? Yeah, of course that's a fucking thing that happens. Happens all the time. It's all of what you can call like political strategy. And so then do some people get very good at intentionally lying and misinforming? You were a poker player, right? A bluff is
done that before.
Yeah. And so you were intentionally mastering the art of disinformation for a game theoretic advantage, right? And the soccer player does it when they fake to go this way and then they actually go this way. Or they're like, in any game theoretic scenario, truth about reality equals competitive advantage. So you want to throw the other guy off. So if I'm a politician or if I'm running a business and trying to corner the market or whatever it is, I'll try to both withhold my true information and create some false information so I can advance. So
depending on the goal of the defined goal, right? If your goal is your personal advance, then maybe yes. But if your goal is to actually make the society flourish, then
that's why
not.
I said in a competitive game theoretic scenario where we're not talking about a coordination game, right? But a zero-sum type game.
Yeah.
So then truth becomes one of the weapons. It becomes one of the things that we fight the battle with. So withholding information, trade secrets, patents, classified information, and then disinforming, right? Propaganda, whatever. Well, you don't have to study history very much to see that you can see the entire lens of the history of the world through that lens. And it's a very insightful lens. And Sun Tzu was talking thousands of years ago about how to conspire effectively, right? And how to break conspiracies effectively. And Machiavelli was talking about it. And so the idea that that's not a thing is just silly. That said, lots of the conspiracy theories that said such and such is going to happen by this date never fucking happen. And so they're like objectively, clearly wrong. And so to kind of generally bias towards or away from that as a whole class is silly. You can't think of it as a class in that way. But let's just say that we do. And we're looking at the people who do. So I've never actually seen an information ecology, a news ecology more fucked up than I'm seeing right now with regard to COVID, because you've got it's not even just the popular news, it's even science journals, right? It's the UK saying, oh, we're going to stay open and do herd immunity. And then a couple of days later, oh, fuck, actually everyone's going to die because the Imperial College just said this thing. And so we're actually going to lock down for 18 months. And then, oh, no, we overcorrected in that. And so the range even of within the scientific literature of ideas and guesses about it is orders of magnitude off. And partly that's because it's a novel virus. And partly it's because things like epidemiology are actually complex. And this one, where you have a long contagious asymptomatic period, is particularly complex to try to forecast. The unknown unknowns are quite high. So similarly, anyone who has a kind of sense in them of mistrust of the state and state type authorities. And they think that any state action that is going to decrease their freedom is probably some deep state conspiratorial cabal that is trying to remove everyone's freedoms and oppress them. They're going to just automatically tend to react to certain news in their newsfeed more than others, right? This is where the confirmation bias thing comes in. And since most people, when they read news, they aren't reading science journals, they're reading news that maybe discusses something in science, and they don't go check the science journal themselves, they decide at a feeling level, this feels true. They don't even realize they're doing it, right? Because they didn't go through and look at the science journal, look at all the journals on the topic, find the experts who disagree, find why they disagree, look at the methodology and see, is the conclusion epistemically grounded? There's like, see, I knew the thing wasn't real, or see, I knew it was going to kill everyone, where really it's just hitting a predisposition that's resonant, and then they're going with that resonance. But it goes in both ways, right? So there are the other side that just generally tends to think that there is this thing called legitimate authority and legitimate experts, and that science is real and science has the answers, and that there are these things called science deniers, and they might be anti-climate changers or anti-vaxxers or whatever, and they're all dangerous and they're all problems, and we just need to like trust the scientific authorities and they'll tell us what to do. And that's also kind of like an emotional disposition more than it is a very well analyzed position, right? And they're both silly. They both have a little bit of truth too, and they're both silly, right? And it's important to see the truth, because otherwise you won't understand a lot of why the world thinks what it is, and you won't be able to be effective if you don't understand why people think what they think. And you'll also be getting it wrong if you don't understand the partial truth. So if I'm to say, okay, there's a group of people for whom, if anything comes from a major authoritative scientific institution, they assume it's part of the Great Conspiracy. And it's the standard model bias and whatever. Well, that's just silly, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of major universities that empirically works. Like, we test it and it makes better computers. Like, it fucking works. There's no question. It's a real thing. And then on the other side, the idea that there's this perfect, beautiful thing called the peer review in the halls of academia that just does the perfect epistemics, and there's no ego or bias, and the finances that influence the nature of what's being researched don't play a role at all. That's just silly, right? And there's so much stuff now where we have seen people that are actively falsifying and fucking up their research, or even where they're not doing that, but like somebody puts something that is gibberish on purpose into peer review, and it gets published in an article in a place like Nature, and people peer review stuff based on the politics of who they need to get on the good side of for their own career advancement. And then even things like, okay, well, even if something isn't wrong, the things that are getting funded are the things that somebody wants to fund because they see that there will be an ROI on that. And there might be other things that would be more true and more relevant that will never get funded because there's no ROI. So then we say the preponderance of data shows such and such, but it was the preponderance of data all in this one little area of the whole picture based on incentives. So it's misinforming, even if it's all true, right? So then we have to say, like, does the fact that science needs funded and is done by people with egos and with politics involved, does that fuck up the epistemics of it? Yeah, of course it does. And it doesn't completely fuck it up. So ultimately, for me, I actually go into the science article. I look at the methodology. I look at if the methodology makes sense. I try to look at all of the literature and try to do kind of structured literature review. Then I try to find experts in the field who disagree and see if I can find out why they disagree, take the perspectives, and I can start to make sense of it, right? So are the people who say just trust the institutions, are they right? No, the WHO got this wrong from the beginning, again and again. And it's almost a perfect record of getting things wrong. And many of the main universities that were doing epidemiological models were like bad. They're pretty bad. And so we should just trust the authorities. It's just silly. That's just not paying attention. On the other hand, And, we can see the WHO and the Gates Foundation and places like that doing randomized control trials on antivirals for use in the intensive case, which is once people are in hospitals, when in the entire field of medicine, antivirals almost only work immediately after exposure, not once you already have a severe illness. And so it's like, that doesn't even, why would anyone even do that trial? That doesn't even make sense. I mean, yes, you might want to see if like by surprise, it helps late stage people because that'd be cool, but also include early stage, which is where there's really only any chance. But if you do late stage and then say it doesn't work and generalize it as if to early stage, maybe you're just really being kind of dull and not paying attention to the entire body of antiviral knowledge.
Or maybe
you want to show that Trump was an idiot and do an information warfare piece that attacks hydroxychloroquine, or maybe because you're a Democrat or a supporter or just hate him or whatever it is. Or maybe you have a drug that you really like and the generic drugs that nobody's going to make any money on, it would be better to show are ineffective. Now, are people that fucked up? Yeah. Like that kind of information warfare is a real thing. And so it's important to know that the information we're being exposed to has agendas attached to it. And the agendas are not always the ones they say they are. The agendas are usually complex. So now, then the other side that says the entire thing is nonsense, that this is basically a flu, nobody's really dying. That's also just gibberish. And all you have to do is call some ICU doctors in New York and ask about their experience, or in Italy, and you'll never fucking say that again, which I did, early on. I was talking to them and working with them.
How was that? How was that? What did they say?
They were describing seeing disease progression that was unlike anything that they had seen before. The whole ground glass opacities in the lung, the rate at which people would degrade and break down, the complete failure of ventilation to do what they would normally think it to do in pneumonias. They were very boggled by the pathology. It didn't follow anything that they could make sense of at all. And then they were also completely fucking devastated, just putting people on intubation and taking them off dead all day. And having to go in without PPE and without adequate PPE, and having to it's a trip, because if the doctors or nurses who decide to go work mostly would quarantine themselves at a hotel and some were just staying in their car or whatever, because they don't want to go back by their family and possibly kill their family. But that also means that they know that they might be leaving their children parentless because they don't want to leave these people dying. So it's intense. And there's a massive disrespect to that whole thing when you just say the whole thing was a farce, because you didn't even do the research deep enough to try to figure it out. Now, that side, though, that says the whole thing is a farce because of just some control agenda. Are there control agendas? Yes, of course there are. And the thing isn't a farce. And it is being utilized opportunistically. The whole don't let a good crisis go to waste. Well, if I'm playing the market, when the market has more volatility, if I'm one of the better players that has more insight, I'm going to do a lot better than when the market doesn't have volatility. And so a few people have made a shit ton of money in the last couple months when almost everybody lost a lot of money, like the movement of trillions of dollars that basically concentrated. And so if I'm a major financial player in the hedge fund world or whatever, and I have intelligence briefings, it tells me this thing has jumped out of Wuhan and it's going to fuck the world up and whatever. Could I, with all of my money and connections, try to talk to the CDC and the WHO and the president, whatever, and get them to do a better job of handling this? Well, I could. I probably would succeed at that, but I'm not going to, because that's not my job. And I'm not motivated to do that. And my fiduciary responsibility to shareholders anyways is to maximize profit. And I'm about to fucking short this market completely, sell the stocks at the top and then buy shit back up at the bottom for, a fraction of what it was worth a couple months ago and will be worth again very soon. Now, in the same way that market volatility creates the opportunity for more power grabs, it also creates the opportunity. Increased volatility in the world creates an opportunity for more political power grabs. And so before this happened, China was trying to advance the Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia was trying to get Eastern Europe back into deeper alliance with it. And a couple different forces in the US were pretty focused on fighting each other for the US power grab. And so then when this situation comes, they just keep doing the thing they were doing, just using the increased volatility of trillions of dollars of stimulus money and who can get it and shit like that. But that also then ends up influencing media narratives and even what science is getting funded. And so then we look at things like contact tracing. Okay, well, we have to do diagnostics so that we can stop the spread of the disease. But then if someone tests positive, we want to know everyone that they've interacted with so that we can go test them as well. Because otherwise you'll have, a single person who's asymptomatic can reinfect the whole world. So we're going to empower some kind of phone-based app to do contact tracing. Should people be concerned about that from a civil liberties surveillance point of view? Absolutely. Like, that's a really terrible thing that shouldn't happen in that way. And it's a really valuable thing. And these are both true, right? Like, I think we need contact tracing. And I don't want high-tech surveillance that will never be removed afterwards. Because if you look, I'll speak to the US here because I know it better. When an emergency happens, we'll usually put in a provisional emergency act to deal a wartime type act. But we don't repeal it after the fucking thing's over, hardly ever, because once power players have got more power, they don't tend to give it back, right? They don't have to. And everybody else customizes and moves on, and Kardashians or whatever. And so the FISA Act or the Patriot Act or the Homeland Security Act or those don't roll away. Okay, so after 9/11 and we realized they didn't really have weapons of mass destruction, do we roll those acts back? No. And so is that this type of situation again, but where we even start getting into wanting to breach people's biomedical security and be able to determine whether they can travel or not based on whether they have antibodies or vaccinated, or I think that's really dangerous. And I think we need to do contact tracing. Now, I think we can do low-tech contact tracing, just like we did with epidemics throughout all of history, where you just ask people, who did you come in contact with? And I think there are certain forms of contact tracing technologically that are much safer. And I think there are ways to put forced expiries in them, right? But this is where it's like, if you hear, let's say you're kind of left-oriented and you hear the guys who are saying this is just a big hoax and they just want to surveil us, they're partly right. Now, what they're saying as is actually very dangerous and pernicious and problematic, but they're also kind of partly right, which is, are there agendas that are seeking to advance the asymmetric power they already have in this situation, and we should watch out for it? Yes, of course. And typically, when you see that power follows a power law distribution, right? You'll have a few people who have most of the power and then progressively less. The people who got here didn't get it by sharing their power. Like, that's not how that happened. They got it by winning at game theory again and again and again and again and getting good at doing that thing, right? So typically those who have more power, asymmetric power in a power law distribution, use their asymmetric power to protect and get more asymmetry of power. Like, that's the generator function. And they're fighting against other people who are also trying to do it. So, is it going to be Zuckerberg or is it going to be Xi Jinping who gets the Metcalfe law, one ring to rule them all, that creates the digital currency that is the new reserve currency for the world? So then you can even have the plausible deniability of saying, well, I have to do this, otherwise the other guy is going to do the thing, right? Now, that still looks like those with the most power using that radical asymmetric power to concentrate more power. Does that tend to be in the good of everyone? No. Will we give one example where it seems to be in the good of everyone as the source of selling point, the sugar that makes the medicine go down? Sure. So this is when we talk about perspective seeking and the faulty confidence. I only see faulty confidence in kind of mainstream narratives because mostly they live at too low a complexity level to make adequate sense of reality.
But I mean, with increased understanding of complexity, automatically I feel your level of confidence goes down, because the moment you start reaching a level of complexity of understanding how many potential factors go into it, you understand how many factors you don't even have a proper clue about.
Yes. Now you start to become, there was a mayor of a California city who contacted me today, and it was so refreshing. It was one of the few politicians that didn't elicit upset emotions in me. I said that like a politician. So she was lovely, and she said, like, I don't even know what I don't know about this topic. I don't even know what questions to ask. I don't know how to think about it. I don't want to waste your time, but like, I want to make sense of it. And I'm like, I'm so glad that you're the mayor, because someone who seems earnestly like they really care and really wants to do the right thing and knows that they don't know and is seeking to find the right source of input can be trusted with leadership. In the Tao Te Ching, again, you can almost read it. You can read it as a book of religion, or a book of leadership, or a book of political philosophy, and they're all true. But you can read it as a book of leadership, and it kind of has this gist that says the person who wants to lead, everybody should run away from. And that's the kind of, like, those who get asymmetric power because they pursued the fuck out of it, who use it to keep pursuing the fuck out of it, right? But those who really don't want to lead, and everyone pushes them to lead because everyone trusts them so much, you can probably trust them, right? So there is some relationship to the certainty and uncertainty thing in that as well. Mm-hmm. So let's say, for instance, we look at the epidemiology. When we open back up, is it going to spike again? Are we going to get herd immunity? I'll give you just the tiniest example of some elements of the complexity that I'm paying attention to. So the binary narrative of this is basically airborne AIDS and is just going to keep killing everyone until we get a vaccine, or it was overblown hype and we're already over it and we should just release the restrictions, are both just so silly. And yet what is actually true is pretty complex. So when you look at how hard an area gets hit, what are the factors? Well, how many cases arrived there originally before it was known is going to be a factor. What was the viral load of those cases? Was it a light viral load or a serious viral load? And were they super spreaders or not, in terms of what type of interaction were they getting into? What was the population density and the population dynamics? What were the background demographics in terms of age and mixing across ages and comorbidities? Was it an area that had high environmental pollution of the types that would already create lung problems? Did they have previous vaccinations? Because there's some indication that those who got flu vaccines last year got more serious COVID, and that some people who got vaccinations of other types in the third world, it might actually be slightly protective against COVID. There's some indication that people who got one of the coronaviruses last year, the normal 4 strains of coronavirus, actually are getting COVID worse. So the antibodies are not only not protective, but priming a cytokine storm. So then we would have to ask, did that area have a previous bad coronavirus as part of its flu season? What types of interventions did the area put in place? How early did it put those interventions in place? What are the cultural dynamics regarding hygiene and closeness of contact and things like that would already be part of, mitigating the differences? It's a lot of variables, and a lot of those variables are like a tiny change in an exponent makes a pretty big difference over a little period of time. Right? So a lot of those are exponent variables or near thresholds. Now, we didn't even get into mutations yet, but could it be that some of the areas that are hit much harder than others actually correspond to more and less virulent mutations? Yes, that is not well enough known yet, but we'll know it soon, right? Being tracked. And so if you look at one area that seems, now, then we also even say, well, but how many people are actually infected? Well, what tests are we doing?
Yeah, that's the part I want to ask you about, actually, about the testing.
Yeah, so if we're only testing sick people and then trying to estimate, of course we have no background idea. And then if we're trying to test other places, what are the other places that actually give us relevant background information? Because if the people are coming out and interacting, they might already be a higher risk population than the people who aren't coming out and interacting. And right, so it's like, how do you get appropriate sample? That's one question. Then what are the false negatives and false positives of the type of test methodology that I'm using? And if I'm using immunoassays, we have some evidence coming out of China that about 30% of the people who have the disease were we really pretty sure they had the disease, like they had the symptomology and PCR showed that they had the disease. About 30% of them don't produce antibodies. So that's not even about a false negative. False negative means when they're producing antibodies, the test doesn't pick it up. This is that they just aren't even doing it, right? We also know that, let's say that you got coronavirus today, you got SARS-CoV-2 today, you wouldn't be producing antibodies for some period of time, we'll call it 10 days, because it's got to go through the mucosal system into the blood. The blood's got to produce enough antibodies that test picks it up. So we wouldn't even call that a false negative yet, because it's not that the antibodies in the blood and the test just isn't sensitive enough. It's that it's too early in the disease progression, but you might be infectious that entire time, right? Then there's some question if some of the original tests that got released had a bunch of false positives because they actually reacted with antibodies from the previous coronaviruses that people have been exposed to. And so some of the things about, much higher background rate, and so that we're already closer to saturation. Then we have to say, well, does saturation mean anything even, because is immunity being conferred? We don't know if immunity is being conferred right now. So all ideas on herd immunity are premature at this point. You can date whatever date this is that we're talking, because are there people who got COVID, got better, and then had it again? Yes, a lot, like 5 to 10% of people in the Hubei province and in South Korea and Japan. Now, do we know that it's the same strain as opposed to one strain than another strain? We don't know. Immunoassays won't even tell you that, right? Most of the types of immunoassays. Do we know that they fully got rid of it and then they got it again exogenously versus their viral load just went down and then resurged without ever having fully got rid of it? We don't know the answer to those things, right? Now, when people say, this when you have the antibodies, so of course you're immune. No, there are viruses that you'll produce antibodies to that don't produce immunity. And there are some viruses where the second time you get it is much worse, like dengue fever, right? And obviously with Ebola or HIV or Hep C, our answer wasn't herd immunity, right? Our answer was fucking stop the suppression of those things. And so it tends to be that herd immunity will be our answer for respiratory things that are very hard to suppress because they're fucking respiratory things and that are part of the evolutionary background that we've been exposed to. But if it's novel, right, meaning we didn't co-evolve with this thing, then how long will it take to produce effective antibodies is a very unknown question. And so you could even get to where you have a saturation of the population, and then now you could also have a situation where someone produces antibodies and you can't think of everyone the same. Like we said, about 30% of the people weren't producing meaningful number of antibodies. And so it might be that some people do produce an antibody response that confers some immunity and some don't. And that you might have a Gaussian distribution or some other kind of distribution across the population. You might also have that there was one Chinese study that showed that older people were producing about 3 to 5x more antibodies than younger people, which would be opposite of what we'd want to see. So that could actually mean that it is priming an immune response that is of the more cytokine storm type that makes it worse. There are ways we could figure this out, but it hasn't happened yet. And now also, as it's mutating, are we going to have a worse round to follow up like happened with 1918 Spanish flu? Well, we won't be able to know perfectly, but we can look at the nature of how it's mutating so far, which regions have good error correction in them, et cetera, and start to make some good forecasts. But I would say there's still massive unknowns in there. Then what happens when SARS-CoV-2 and influenza hit at the same time in this next flu season? We don't know. And so the right answer is, this is a pretty complex multifactorial thing. And whether people get immunity or not, and whether the immunity lasts for 2 years or only 2 months, and whether the immunity will be effective against meaningful mutations or not, and whether it's mutating or not, and whether it's the same for the whole population or only for parts of the population, and whether it primes a worse secondary response. And if we came up with a vaccine, because we saw that the influenza vaccine that people did last year, it looks like produced about a 25% more severe response in people who got COVID because it was shunting the immune function in a particular direction. Might we actually make a vaccine for this that doesn't protect against the mutation and actually primes them to be worse, that are already more lethal ones? There's a lot of pretty important fucking unknowns. So what you want to do is list them all, right? And then say, what kind of research do we need to do to figure these things out? And how do we coordinate the international research efforts? And how do we make sure the methodology is appropriate? And how do we coordinate a global exit strategy? Because there really are no national exit strategies, right? If herd immunity is a thing, maybe there's a national exit strategy. But otherwise, no country gets to return to normal if it doesn't get to open trade and travel back up. And given that only one person who's asymptomatic has to have it to re-trigger the whole fucking thing, this is a uniquely interconnecting for the whole world situation, right? And we know that what works in Vienna isn't going to be the solution for India and Bangladesh just because of cost per capita. And yet a solution that doesn't work for India and Bangladesh keeps Vienna unsafe or unable to open. It's like, okay, so we need a global exit strategy. And we can think about that. Like, what are the various types of exit? Herd immunity would be one. Well, we got to answer the questions to see, is that even a thing, right? And if it's not a thing right now, can we make it a thing? Can we make it to where, are there things that we can do to help prime people's immune system to have better immune responses, right? What about vaccination? Similarly, we haven't succeeded at vaccines for the 4 coronaviruses that have been around forever. There's a lot of viruses that took us a very long time to find effective vaccines, and things like the flu that mutate a lot don't work for the ongoing mutation. So does that mean that this is a new thing that we just have forever and have to take new, vaccines for forever? So with the unknowns there, then we say, well, maybe we'll just, the end state is suppression. We just have to diagnose everyone and contact trace to just fully suppress it the way we would Ebola. It's really hard with something that is asymptomatic for possibly weeks or months or forever in some people, and yet they're infectious. Like, that's kind of uniquely terrible as far as contagion goes. And how are you going to really contact trace and diagnose everyone in Bangladesh? That's a pretty serious technological rollout, per capita dollar wise. So then we start saying, well, that we can, some amount of that has to happen, right? We definitely want to suppress where we can, but also the herd immunity answer affects that, right? Now, animals are getting it, and we live with the animals. If the animals can store it, do we ever get to full suppression if it's zoonotic and can keep passing back now? And our cats and dogs and shit are getting it. Well, that's a whole, there's more variables, right? So then we get into the management. Well, how do we treat it? Can we make it to where it really is only as bad as the flu? The early stage antiviral makes it not that bad. Well, the exit strategy, those are like clusters of exit strategies, and some are better than others, but only if they're true. And in order to be true, there's shit we have to figure out. So what we need is a coordinated approach for the entire world to come up with an exit strategy.
Great. As easy as that.
Well, no, we've got a couple more parts. We have to make sure that our exit strategy will also be good for follow-up mutation rounds that could occur and follow-up pandemics, because we're in a situation where that's could be a thing again anytime, right? And they could be much more lethal. We were lucky that this one wasn't more lethal than it was. So we have to also be creating ongoing pandemic infrastructure. We also have to make sure that we aren't making the world worse by the nature of our solution, so that we don't create radically fucked up autocracies and surveillance states and increase surveillance capitalism and decrease people's health privacy, or do rushed vaccines where we didn't do long-term safety studies that fuck stuff up. So we have to solve the problem, set up infrastructure for the next rounds of the problem, make sure we don't make shit worse at minimum, and then hopefully also set up more competent responses for other types of catastrophes, which are also impending, and deal with the second and third order effects that have already started from this, right? We already have had a breakdown in the food supply because of this, right? So India, Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, but also in the United States, the animal husbandry, we're culling huge numbers of chickens and pork and whatever because they can't be sold because they're sold to fast food restaurants, and then people starving in other areas. These are supply chain intelligence breakdown issues. For 2 billion people's food supply just got fucked up. And the US-China tensions in terms of superpower war just radically increased, and geopolitical tensions in the EU and whatever. So we also have to solve those issues and prevent the worst escalations from happening. Now, thinking about it through the lens of militarism, right? Increased conflict escalation between state actors, or just increasing violence within states from non-state actors of people who feel really like their government is suppressing them or really upset or whatever. So thinking through the lens of conflict escalation and violence escalation is a type of perspective to take, right? And then within that, taking a uniquely Chinese perspective or a Russian perspective or US perspective or an EU or a particular country are also going to give very different insights. Taking the perspective of finance or economics or supply chains or the global south and poverty or the info ecology and journalism or all of those, or cyber warfare or medicine or what life is like inside the ICU, to actually be able to sense make it well enough to come up with solutions, all of those are perspectives that have to be well understood.
Do you have the feeling that current governments do that, or to what degree do you think they do that?
Well, so governments have government agencies that are designed to look at different things, right? They have agencies that look at logistics and supply chains and look at national security threats of different types and look at regulation of news and various things. So the question is, how well do they do it? And to call governments a class and unify across them would be silly, because it's a pretty radical distribution between how well some do it and others. As a function of lots of things, partly as a function of how small the country is and how homogeneous the population and the kind of GDP per capita of it, and historical things, and how established the culture is. All of those things all augment the nature of the government and what kinds of wars and overhauls and shit did it go through it. So we could do that by a country by country basis, but the big countries, like China, does a very good job of coordinating all of this stuff. But I can't say they do a good job of coordinating it for the interest of the world. They do a good job. I can't even say they do a good job of coordinating it for the interest of China. And I won't say China does a good job. I'll say the CCP does a very good job of coordinating lots of functions in a top-down way, probably the best job in the world right now. And they do it in a way that is good for the CCP and its vision of China. The US completely sucks shit at it. The US is, it's undergone such intensive institutional decay. And democracies typically last 200 to 300 years. We're coming up on 250 years. This looks like what an empire about to fall looks like, where it's so divided amongst itself that it's not paying attention to the outside world adequately. So China is advancing the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of being able to be on the other side of this issue and bring PPE and medical supplies to other places in the world, and we can't even fucking figure out how to deal with it for ourselves and get PPE to our own hospital workers. And inside the US, you have a very strong kind of like establishment versus Trump insurgency thing that are fighting for the power capture in the US because the power is so big. And while they're doing it, not being geopolitically strategic enough. or doing a good job of actually tending to the people or the crisis or whatever. Yeah, we could talk about different places, but.
And what do you think would be the most relevant things to tackle right now to improve that, or the best parts to put energy towards too?
Clarify that question for me.
So if you observe, okay, like America is doing a terrible job at that right now, what do you think would be the things to prioritize right now? Like, where do you think would be the energy most spent on? Or how would you approach, if you would be the president of the United States, how would you approach it?
Okay, I want to make sure I understand the question right. What are the most important things to respond to COVID as the president of the United States? Or how could we actually correct US governance and reverse the institutional decay so it would naturally have the capacity to do a good job with anything?
I was the first part was more around the COVID response,
Okay.
but I would like to lead into a general structure of a governance.
Okay. Some things I'd like to see the US doing. I would like to see the US working with all of its international allies to lead a global exit strategy, and that identifies the various types of exits that might be, and coordinates the world's scientific research happening at all the different institutions towards making sure that they're not duplicating similar research, they're not withholding the research or not having it synthesized in a central place. There aren't critical topics that are getting under-addressed and white space being left. So I would have a international coalition effort towards global exit strategy. It would identify what the types of exits could be and what needs to be known to figure those out, and then be coordinating the research towards that. That's one thing. In the meantime, that alliance effort would also work with all of the groups, all the countries that want to ally, which is not just European allies, but Japan and South Korea and Singapore and Vietnam and other countries that did a better job of this than we did and went through SARS-CoV-1 and other things. And like, they just have this shit more figured out than we do. And, you know, most of the countries I just mentioned are wealthy countries and like high-tech countries. Like, so to not include Japan and South Korea and Singapore in an alliance effort would just be silly, especially given their relationship with China and ours and the tensions and whatever. And an alliance effort to get PPE, medical supply, and support to all of the countries that are later than us in the curve, and information to them, and particularly many of the poorer countries, because there is no solution that isn't a solution for everybody on this thing. And if China is the major exporter of solutions, that's going to result in a particular kind of world order. And this has nothing to do with the Chinese people or Chinese history or Chinese culture, but the current government that uses radically technologically advanced autocracy is just not the type of global governance we want for the world, right? We want to suppress that wherever it happens, in the US, in China, wherever, which is also why I'm saying this needs to be an alliance effort so that nobody gets to do the power grab. But the US is in the best position to lead it if it really did the good thing that it could do, right? I would definitely like to see I would like to see some major effort towards protecting the upcoming elections and be able to show that, be able to create confidence across both parties and across everyone that the election was not going to be manipulated, rigged, or stolen, and create the kinds of process and transparency to do that. It's a long discussion of how to do that, but it so obviously needs done. And then with that secured, really work for not narrative politics stuff, but bipartisan cooperation towards pandemic solution. There's a lot of things that the U.S. So I think that the U.S. needs to roll out very high-tech PCR diagnostics pretty ubiquitously, so that we can see it very early stage with very high sensitivity and be able to both isolate and start treating right away, so the economy can open back up without spreading the pandemic vector again. It should be investing very heavily in early stage treatment so that when people do get it, they don't have to wind up in the ICU with serious illness. So a lot of early stage treatment research. They should prioritize existing drugs, not new drugs. So hydroxychloroquine was actually a right thing to look at, and ivermectin and methylene blue and PDE inhibitors and a bunch of the ones that have been around for a long time. A new drug, we have no long-term safety data on. So it might not kill you or do some, like, this is one of the interesting things is we will look for some signs of safety. We'll look at liver enzymes and a few things, but we don't know what stuff to look for, right? There's a lot of biometrics you could track in a body. So under a pandemic, you might be tempted to rush the normal process, but rushing the normal process on a new thing where we have no long-term safety data is very different than drugs that have been around for 20 or 50 or 70 years. We have a shit ton of safety data, and all we're trying to find is new application, right? I'm totally happier to rush a new application of a known safety profile. I want to rush new drugs less, and I want to rush vaccines even less, because unlike small molecule drugs, vaccines are intended to have permanent effects. And so I really want to make sure they're the right permanent effects, right? If they're intending to modulate the immune system lastingly, then of all the drugs that you want to do long-term safety studies on, vaccines are the most important. So yes, ubiquitous diagnostics, contact tracing, I would like to see them doing, employing 100,000 people, which people need employed anyways to do contact tracing, that don't require everyone activating their Bluetooth or the things like that open up hacking and intelligence community issues and surveillance of different types. Mm-hmm. I would like to see the distribution of medical supplies and PPE and resources like that happen at a federal level. They don't have to override state sovereignty and control the states to support the states with supply chain capacities that our federal government has historically done. I'd like to see that. And obviously the economic stimulus needs handled quite differently.
Mm-hmm. I actually want to lead over to second and third order effects of COVID and the responses, because I really appreciate your insights into the interconnectedness of different topics and how things on a global scale as well are connected, but also through sectors. So how do you perceive, or what do you perceive as the most relevant second and third tier or order effects of COVID? Now that you've mentioned financial, I think that's probably going to be one of the areas that are going to be really affected by it.
Well, there's super obvious ones, and then there's ones that are a little bit less obvious, and then there's ones that we don't know what is going to happen. So one pretty obvious, pretty bad one we mentioned was the food supply. When you try to stop travel to stop a virus, you can also break supply chains. And in this case, you break the supply chain of pesticides for areas that do monocropped agriculture and depend upon those. And that's the only way they can control the locusts. And you end up getting these massive numbers of locusts throughout Northern Africa and parts of the Middle East that destroy all the crops. And under quarantine, not letting farmers and distributors and whatever be able to work, so food is rotting in the fields. And similarly, so many of the major agricultural producers of potatoes, chicken, pork, eggs, whatever, are used to selling to a small number of vendors. They sell to McDonald's, and the McDonald's does the distribution throughout its network. And when people aren't going to McDonald's, the people still need the food. They're not getting it at McDonald's. McDonald's isn't doing it. And the farms aren't, or the agricultural manufacturers, I won't call them farms, aren't set up to get it directly to the people. So they're just, like in the US, they're culling millions of animals, just killing the animals and throwing them out, burying potatoes and food and whatever, while there are millions of people with no access to food. You've got hundreds of millions of people who have very bad food security. In India right now, a bunch of people starving. In sub-Saharan Africa, you have people in refugee camps who can't leave, who don't have food. But even in the US, in El Paso, you have these miles-long lines of cars waiting for food. And so can violence happen because of that pretty quickly? Yeah. That could kill a lot more people than COVID ever would have killed. So that's a very serious issue. Now, that's a second order effect, right? Can the violence lead to war? Can the war escalate as larger third order effects? Yeah. And, when you start to look at existing political tensions and where high technological military power is, one of the ones I'm most concerned about is India. Because if millions or tens or hundreds of millions of people stop having access to food, do they just die peacefully? Or do they start to go into resource wars? If they go into resource wars, how does it cleave? Well, probably along existing tension lines. Might that look like Muslim-Hindu lines, especially in northern parts of India? Could that lead to an India-Pakistan war, right? Like, these are nuclear-equipped countries. So that's one example, but there's a lot of those types of examples. We also have breakdown in the supply chains of medical equipment and medicines. That's a pretty huge deal. We have the true idea that dollars are dirty, right? That cash is actually a vector for disease transmission of a disease that lives on surfaces, and to increase the impetus that was already there by a number of actors towards a digital currency. A digital currency is a massive fucking power play. Because let's say we look at the digital currency that China's been working to roll out. As much as you would think that there are issues with something like WeChat or whatever that is a very state-engaged company, it still has some degree of autonomy as a company. But this is basically a digital currency issued by the Chinese Communist Party directly, which means that, like, there's anonymity in cash, right? Nobody actually knows where I spend my cash. With a digital currency, it is a perfected financial surveillance apparatus to know exactly how much money I have, where it is, which accounts I move it to, when, and everything else, right? So, of course, governments want that, right? Like, a lot of governments would want that to make sure tax evasion isn't happening and whatever. And if you really trusted your government to be totally awesome, you might be okay with that. But this whole power corrupts absolutely thing keeps fucking stuff up. And so then there is we know that people don't want a bunch of different currencies. And what is the world reserve currency? So then we also start looking at the oil price shocks, right? And seeing oil get down to a negative price, that's an unprecedented thing. But besides the fact that that's a huge deal, and what does it mean? And it goes negative when there's not enough storage to store the existing oil. So then is that going to lead to somebody realizing that there's an opportunity to create a lot more oil storage as a financial opportunity? Yes. Does that mean that with the price dropping and more oil storage, we might actually have climate change go in the worst direction because of starting to have cheap oil open up whole new oil markets and demand start to increase in other areas? Yeah, totally. What does it mean in terms of militarism? Well, we know that when the price of oil drops to almost nothing, only the companies with the most money on hand can survive for very long, right? So Saudi Arabia will do fine for a while, and Russia will do fine for a while as basically major wealthy state-sponsored oil producers. But a lot of smaller states and private companies will start collapsing. And so then is that just a radical concentration of power again? Yeah, probably. And then what type of geopolitical tensions does that create? Because let's say that some smaller country loses their economic capability. They can't take care of their people, but they still have a military. Well, it's a bad position to have your economics go to shit and still have a military, because then you have to deal with it somehow, right? So these types of geopolitical things that we're talking about here, there's a lot of them. And you can see that then increasing the price of oil, we start looking at, and that was related to the situation. There was already systemic fragility, but that was because of a decrease in demand for oil and then the war over increasing the supply and whatever. Now, we could look at that moving in the direction of affecting climate change, or in the direction of affecting geopolitical tensions towards war or financial concentration, right? This, like, it branches pretty fast. Then we have all the shit like the increase in domestic abuse happening, like really kind of gruesome spousal and child abuse, because there's a lot of fucked up people in the world. And a lot of the way that people survive is by avoiding their family. And under this situation where they can't, you get increase in those types of violence. So then what happens also when, like, the people in New York or in Italy know, everybody knows a lot of people that died. So you have like generational trauma, like happened with a Great Depression or a war or whatever. So then what are the lasting societal effects of that? Lasting societal effects of, of existential fear and of kind of more ubiquitous trauma. What happens to the generation of kids who all lose a pretty meaningful period of school time? Lots of things like this. The domestic elections in the US are not secure at this point, cannot be considered secure. When trillions of dollars of new money just get made up, like, what is that? And I don't think anyone thinks those will be really rightly distributed to everyone, right? But unlike in 2008, they didn't all go to the big bank usual brokers. They went to some new brokers that seem to be more associated with the kind of current insurgency that's in the White House rather than the establishment forces. So you also see like competition at the very top of global and US finance in a way that's different. So how do those shocks ripple out? We could go into any of those you want, but it's just giving examples of starting to think about what second and third order and cascading effects look like, and what cascading effects on systemic fragility looks like. Because if you had where all the countries didn't need import or export, right? They had fully domestic economies. Well, it wouldn't be quite the same thing. But when you have globalized supply chains where every single country in the world depends upon 6 continent type supply chains, and where you have tensions all over the place, and you have very powerful weapons associated with the tensions, and you have technologies that radically concentrate power, like digital Metcalfe law type stuff. And so we're dealing with, and I would say if it wasn't coronavirus, something else would have done the same thing. It could have easily been like the fires that happened in Australia that were partly related to the climate that was dry and hot. That dry, hot thing similarly hitting India and driving food death there for that reason could have led to this whole thing. Or what was happening in the Amazon that could break the hydrological pump and affect the rainfall for North America. Basically, we just needed something big enough to start to set off the systemic fragilities. The systemic fragilities haven't always been there because it's unique to globalization. It's unique to, up until World War II, we didn't have technology big enough to fuck up everything. Like, we tried to fuck up everything. Like, you look at Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great and the Romans, like, we would use our technology to fuck shit up for personal gain. But how much stuff we could destroy was limited by how powerful we were. World War II was when we were like, oh, we actually have the power to make the whole place uninhabitable. Well, in evolutionary time, that's just like a minute ago. And we made this entire world system, the whole Bretton Woods world, the World Bank and the UN and everything, to make sure we never used that power, right? That we didn't use the nukes again. But nukes are super hard to make, right? You're enriching uranium is super hard to do. You can monitor it from satellites. The uranium doesn't exist in that many places. And so when you have two superpowers and one catastrophe weapon, you can do mutually assured destruction and make sure nobody uses it. But when you start getting to drone weapons and AI-controlled drone weapons and bioweapons and all of the other kind of exponential tech media weapons that are not that hard to make, and you have a world today where you've got dozens of catastrophe weapons held by many dozens of actors that can't even all be monitored, you can't do mutual assured destruction on that. And when Bretton Woods happened, we weren't near the planetary limits of growth. We hadn't already taken most of the fish out of the ocean or fucked up the coral or got close to the tipping points on the Amazon or any of those types of things. So we could just say, let's just debt-based finance ourselves out of this by printing so much fucking money and exploiting whatever we need to print so much money that we don't have to fight because we just keep having so much positive sum growth. You don't get to do that forever, right? So we really are at a tipping point where we've reached planetary boundaries, and that creates its own fragility. We have these globalized supply chains where collapse anywhere can create collapse in other places. We saw a little fucking problem in Wuhan and the whole world is affected, right? So radically interconnected world, and where too many people have too big of weapons, and not just the kinetic weapons, but even the effect on everyone's psyche of technologies like Facebook and Google, that either we've become powerful enough relative to the now smallness of our world and our own developmental innate capacities that we either figure out how to use that power much, much, much better, or we blow ourselves up with it.
So that's the omni lose-lose scenario you've been talking about around that in the end, if you keep enforcing the win-lose scenarios of one party trying to advance at the cost of the other, it's just eventually going to lead to us destroying the place we live in, basically.
Yeah.
And that's why it needs change.
Yeah, there is that kind of win-lose game theory, not only, like the first thing is that historically it actually worked. Like we actually could kill the other guys and get the riverfront property that they had, and that was awesome, right? And then they stopped competing with us for hunting and whatever. But it wasn't just that it worked, it was obligate. Because if we just wanted to be peaceful, but they're going out killing other tribes and taking their shit, then we have to militarize ourselves to defend ourselves, or we lose by default as soon as anyone militarizes, which is why some of the more peaceful cultures just got slaughtered by the warring cultures. And the effective warring cultures taught each other to war better, and you get this upregulation of war capacity where anybody comes out with a new weapon and everybody has to create counter weapons and new, better weapons, right? So you get this, but ultimately that's an exponential curve. That drives an exponential curve, and it's all externalizing harm on a finite common space. And so we've been in a place where like that has worked. What has worked and has even been obligate as a mode itself will now create the self-termination. And so we need a fundamentally different approach than civilization has ever done or been able to implement previously.
Which requires to understand or to be able to understand that equilibrium, right? Because if you don't look at that time scale, then you're just going to still see that win scenario for you.
Right. And one of the interesting things, the whole think globally, act locally idiom, most people are doing the opposite of that without realizing it, where they're thinking about how to protect their own job and how to get a bonus and get ahead and advance in their social circle and whatever it is. Like they're thinking about some pretty local shit, right? But they're buying stuff that comes from supply chains that happened run by warlords and on 6 continents, backed up by militaries, and pursuing dollars that are basically contracts backed up by militaries that support militaries. So they're buying their food that comes from the factory farms that both create swine flus and bird flus and pandemics and create massive slaughter and ruin the environment. And they don't even realize, but they're causing it. So it's like, who's causing it? Well, I am. I'm acting globally in really atrocious ways for my local optimization and not even knowing it. Go ahead.
What do you do currently to raise more awareness regarding that, or what's your current mission?
So I had a series of processes in my life of realizing that things that I cared about and wanted to solve were connected to other things that I didn't know that I cared about, but that also had to be solved until it came to, if I try to stop these animals from being poached by putting bigger fences, but the poachers are still broke and have the same mindset, they go poach some other animal that might even be more endangered, right? Like, how, in order to really address it, we have to actually address not only the interconnectedness, but what are the driving functions underneath it. And I also went through the process of trying to, like, assuming at first naively that there were approaches already in place that were probably good or adequate. And that started with activism, in the kind of NGO world, and then kind of looking at the maybe UN IGO world, and then seeing if maybe there were economic solutions, if the Austrian school or the anarcho-capitalists had figured it out, or if the Scandinavian model could apply, or the permaculture for the whole world, or whatever, right? Like, and it was clear that they all had some good partial insights, but it could run the fail cases of, why, no, this actually isn't a solution for this whole problem set. So I kept trying to understand the nature of the problems better to be able to see what would an adequate solution look like, or a set of solutions. And the question, like a central question is always very orienting, is what is most needed for civilization and life to thrive that is not being tended to currently? And that both that requires a clear sense of what's needed, right? It requires understanding the current problems and the future risk spaces, and both what isn't addressed and what the highest leverage types of things are in that stack. I would say that there's kind of 3 primary horizons in my current focus. There's what you can think of as the nearer term stuff, which is that there's a bunch of catastrophic risks that if they happen, we won't be able to reverse. And they'll just suck so bad, we must do everything we can to have them not happen. And they're currently imminent, or have a high enough probability that the probability needs radically lowered. And that even though they're being driven by underlying systems, they're being driven by perverse incentive within the nature of how our market and government systems interact, and they're being driven by poor sense making and political power games, whatever, we're not going to be able to fix those underlying systems fast enough. We just have to solve these things kind of directly. And so there's a whole set of ecological things that are actually pretty near tipping points, where without fixing the underlying systems that generate the problem, we just have to keep them from happening. We need to keep large-scale war from happening. We need to pay attention to the very large-scale refugee issues that could happen in the next little while. There's some grid stability, grid collapse stuff, right? There's a handful of things like that. There's also certain kinds of power consolidation that if they happen, we'll probably never get out of, and that are really bad. So we need to keep some of those things from happening. So this is the like triage bucket. It's a pretty big bucket, right? Like any one of those is a pretty big thing, but it's how do we identify all the ways that humanity could go off the rails near term? And so there's a kind of risk assessment to be able to see what the escalation pathways to various kinds of irreversible risk are, and say, how do we close those? There's another thing that has to be happening simultaneous, but is a slightly longer arc, which is institutional change. How do we work with the existing institutions to be able to have them be more oriented in effective directions? So how can we make certain perverse incentives within markets less incentivized? What could we do to make fucked up things more expensive? And what could we do to make things that would be really good more profitable, right? Can we change the topology of the incentive landscape where still incentive-seeking capitalism would incent different things? And within governments, can we do things that force higher kinds of transparency and accountability that decrease the corruption and kind of self-dealing and crony capitalism and regulatory capture? Well, it turns out that there is quite a lot that can be done in those spaces. And for reasons that will take more time than we have today, I will say that the very best we could do in that still won't be long-term adequate, that the underlying axioms, the underlying structures of those systems aren't right, but the new systems that we would want to build from scratch will take quite a while. And so we have to do this vectoring these systems in the right direction because they're the systems that still run the world, right? We've got 50 or $100 trillion that trades hands every day. And so that's a lot of total activity. We have to start vectoring that thing in the right direction as we work on new economic systems that might not be measured in single fungible currencies. So that's the second category, is kind of existing institutional change. The third one is build new civilization systems from scratch that are reverse engineered from defining the problem set well enough. So we identify all the catastrophic risks that could happen, especially as we have increasing technological power. And that power means the ability to do good shit and fucked up stuff, but the fucked up stuff kind of ruins the whole thing, right? So one war ruins everybody's ability who died to do poetry and art and all of the other things, right? So there is an entropic orientation, right? There's an asymmetry that makes entropy easier. It's just easier to break shit than it is to build it. And so, so if we identify, well, what are all of the ways, all the kind of catastrophic and existential risks? What are the things that lead us to making those things happen? What are the system dynamics and the incentives and the whatever? So we call those the generator functions of existential risk. And then rather than try to solve this one and this one and this one separately, can we actually solve those generator functions categorically, which would solve every instance in the class as a new instantiation of a civilization kernel? Can we have a situation where the architecture of the economics has removed perverse incentive fundamentally? So it's removed the evolutionary niche for sociopathic behavior, right? Made it where there's just that doesn't ever pay. Or corruption through the right kinds of transparency and accounting and justice and whatever. So that's been a focus of mine for a bunch of years, because if we couldn't get that, that totally recalibrated my sense of the whole possibility space. And so I was fortunate to have some really incredible people, colleagues, work together for quite some years on that and came to, yes, it is actually possible. There are solutions. If we ask the question, how do we make a world that's anti-fragile, civilization that's anti-fragile, in the presence of having exponential technology kind of available to everybody, decentralized exponential technology, factoring the way that humans are, right? So the kinds of beings that we have been and how we have been stewards of power, can that many of us have that much power and have the thing be anti-fragile? It's a tough problem, right? It was not obvious. There's a solution to it. But we did end up coming up with, yes, there is actually a field of solutions. They don't look like any of the systems we've tried so far, which makes sense, right? They don't look like nation state-based liberal democracy or communism or social. They look like some kind of deeply reimagined premises. But and so there's work happening to build those types of systems, prototype them, refine them, to then be strange attractors of a new model. And the idea would be, and the fundamental basis of them is much higher collective intelligence that leads to better resource utilization. But because of that also leads to better innovation, which also leads to them being able to offer things to the world that the rest of the world needs, so that it engenders healthy relationship rather than enmity, and being able to defend themselves without needing to go offensive and various things like that. So then what we would expect is that if there's a radically more effective civilization system, that other places would want to implement it. And so you start to get a an adoption based on a new attractive basin, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that'll take a few generations. Somebody told me this story. I have no idea if anybody ever thought this was true or not, but the idea makes sense. That in the Exodus story, when the people were leaving Egypt and they took 40 years to do like a 1 month long walk, what was that about? And the metaphor was that they needed a couple generations of people to die off for the slave mentality to be fully gone before starting a new civilization that wasn't still slaves or the children of slaves. And so there were some people that had enough wisdom to say, oh, these people are probably actually not going to be able to let that go. And so we're going to like keep developing new people. And that, at least as a metaphor, there's this idea of that there's a transition between one system and a new system. And that transition requires some generational shift usually. Mm-hmm. So that's why the second category, work with the current institutions to vector them in the right direction, because we're going to need them for a while. So I would say the things that I'm interested in kind of span those three categories.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, I said in the beginning I want to keep it rather to 75 minutes, but I could ask you questions without end. I think that's showcasing why we had a 3-hour conversation back then in the restaurant as well. If you would have to, is there a message that you would like to share that you feel passionate about, or to the audience that you think you would like to leave as a last statement?
I can't say that this is the most important thing I could say, but it's just the first thing that came to mind. It was actually from a conversation I was having with a friend right before we got on the call. So we were talking about dialectic earlier. So here's one dialectic that is kind of interesting. So one of the traits of sociopathy is not feeling a whole category of negative emotions, right? Not feeling remorse or guilt or shame when you do something that hurts people, which is why you're a sociopath or a psychopath or something in that cluster B kind of category. And so it's interesting that if people don't feel certain kinds of negative emotions, they can cause lots more harm to other people, right? Because they don't feel them vicariously. And this also tends to be why people who are oriented that way, this is part of the story, there's also innate power seeking, tend to be in so much more positions of power, is because they, people who don't want to harm anyone usually don't want to make the kinds of decisions necessary to win at power games, where they don't just feel great that they beat out the competition. That means lots of people can't feed their kids and got laid off, but they got a yacht, or the war advanced or whatever. Now there's a lot of spiritual and philosophic and worldview ideas that make us a little bit like a sociopath. They're ways of numbing out pain. And whether it's, always wanting to look on the positive side of everything and look for the kind of silver lining, where it's actually a denial of pain. It's not wanting to be with the reality of it. And you can see this when like someone is grieving the loss of someone close to them and they're fucking hurt and the other person just can't be with it. And they instantly say, well, the good side is, it's like, shut the fuck up. That's not the wrong thing to be saying right now. But there's a lot of people who feel the pain of the world or who feel authentic fear or concern at these types of risks I'm talking about. And then they just get crippled, right? Because they feel kind of overwhelmed with uncertainty and fear and sadness and despair and anger and whatever. And so if it's the case that the people who see the world in a way that actually has them connect to the harms of others less that empowers them more, and those who are connected to the harms of the world more are disempowered, then the world will continue to be run by sociopaths or people who at least have some worldviews that make them sociopath-like. And that's a very bad equation, right? So we need to get on the other side of that thesis, antithesis thing and say, how can I have a real assessment of the problems of the world, a real assessment of the risks of the world, a real assessment of my own uncertainty, and actually be more empowered to act in service of the whole and courageously and in service of what I love than before. And it's a different kind of power, right? It's not the power of how do I be an apex predator and not care when everyone else is just a prey animal that dies. It's how do I have the power to be a steward of the whole? That's possible. It's not common. But I would say it's both possible and it's the necessary new baseline state we need to not blow ourselves up with the amount of power we have. And so if people can think about, is the way that I'm thinking about this increasing my sense of empowerment and increasing my sense of empathy and responsibility for the whole simultaneously? If it is not increasing both of them, keep rethinking about it until you find a way that does.
Which is, to me, similar to if you expand, like I feel every human is thinking about themselves. And for me, that is expanding that sense of self or the things that we care about. And so if I try, like if I only see myself and everything else I don't really care about, then I advance myself at the cost of everything around me. But if that understanding of self, if that level of consciousness is entailing everything around me as well, and I understand that I'm part of a system and I do the best if the system is doing the best, then now I care. And then I take responsibility for the whole rather than just for a virtual line that I drew in the sand. Is that along the lines of what you meant?
Well, you made one step, but I want to go another step.
Okay.
So the step that you made is more intelligent and thoughtful reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism is I do better when the system does better, and the system, other people, so I'll help them because it's good for me. Mm-hmm. Rather than I'll fuck them because I get ahead, I'll find ways that I can, where I help them, I get ahead, but I'm still doing it for me. Mm-hmm. I'm still ultimately coming from a place of focused on, with them. What's in it for me? I'm kind of this miserable, needy thing that just needs to keep getting shit from the world, needs to keep getting stuff and recognition and attention and whatever the fuck it is. And I will do things that are nice to the degree it gives me shit. Like that's a starting place that at least can make people less dreadful fucks to begin with. But you don't actually achieve anything like meaningful happiness as long as you're still focused on what's in it for me, because you're still affirming a self that's empty, right? There is some sense of it's a misunderstanding of self that is some sense that needs a bunch of shit. Mm-hmm. And what you keep getting is more of that sense of self, which means no matter how much shit that you get, whether it's achievement or recognition or whatever, that same kind of sense is there, which is very different than the kind of desire that comes from a place of wholeness and then connectedness to the world, and then a recognition of the intrinsic meaningfulness of others' lives, not because supporting them will make your life better, but just because their life actually matters to you, because you actually give a shit for no selfish reason. And like you can do this thought experiment. Okay, let's say that it was true that when I die, I became a guardian angel, or I had that possibility, right? I'm not saying that's true. It's a thought experiment. So let's say I had that. And I don't have to do anything. If I want to just chill in heaven and listen to music, I can do that. But I have the opportunity to affect people's lives in a positive way sometimes, but they'll never know it. I can divert the ball in the road where the kid doesn't get hit by the car. This question comes, do I ever do that? Do I ever bother having the kid not get hit by the car because I'm not going to get shit from it, right? Well, no, I will get something. I'll get feeling better about myself. Well, that also already has the emptiness of like, I don't feel good about myself and I have to do something like that. No, when that mom is crying, watching her baby get hit and whatever, like I feel it. Not because I need something or whatever, but because I can resonate with that. Her experience is as deep to universe as mine is. I'm not the only focal point of it. And if I can think about that kid's life, and I can think about the whole universe experiencing itself through this kid in these unique ways and falling in love for the first time, and when he becomes a parent and whatever, and I'm like, that's just actually beautiful. And I want to be in service to that for no obvious reason for me at all. I think the switch where people start to have a sense of wholeness that doesn't need a bunch of stuff from other people in the world, and then can, from that place of wholeness, actually show up to other people because you care about them, not because you want to get something out of doing something for them. That's when life starts to me.
Mm-hmm. I find that a very, very, very nice and interesting thought. It was interesting when you described it, I was thinking, okay, but this sense of self then isn't really, there's not the separation anymore. It's like, right. if you relate and if you empathize and if you feel, then it's not like you experience them. It's more like it's kind of the same.
So now go back and read any scripture of the world and see that it was talking about that, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself, not as much as. What the fuck does that mean, right? And or that the naming is the beginning of the 10,000 things in the Tao Te Ching, because it's in okay, I'm this separate dude over here. I'm Daniel, you're you, we're not. Really? I'm Daniel. This is me. This isn't me. This isn't me. Is that okay? So who the fuck am I without the planet? I'm not the planet. Who am I without the planet? Well, I'm fucking nothing. Who am I without the atmosphere? I'm nothing. Who am I without the plants that make the atmosphere? I'm nothing. I have to take for granted that the thing that I call me depends on all this other stuff. I have to take that for granted to say this is me, but I don't exist without all of it. So the idea of me is just actually an ontologically ill-formed idea. Like it's just a philosophically bad concept. I am an emergent property of this universe. And of course there's some autonomy, but you try to take me as autonomous in the middle of outer space with nothing, and I don't fucking do that well, right?
But then there is a case to say, like, if your understanding of me is all encumbering, then you want me still to do well.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's just not Daniel anymore, but it's like everything.
And then that is the bodhisattva impulse, or the Christic impulse, or where the impulse to really serve life comes from. It comes from actually, like where the service impulse, at first, it comes from some like fear of hell or desire to please some nasty god, or projecting the desire for parental approval on the rest of the world or whatever, like all that child consciousness nonsense. And then it's even wanting to like respect myself, and I have these values and I want to be the kind of person I respect. Okay, that's fine. Those are steps. They all serve a role. But beyond that, like when you read Rumi or you read Hafez or you read Saint Francis, they were just fucking in love with the beauty of the world. They just loved the birds and the trees and they saw the beauty of it, and they were just fucking in love with it. And the desire to serve that which you're in love with is just a naturally arising thing.
That sounds awesome.
And this is now back to perspective and perception is Like when people do mushrooms, when they do psilocybin, one of the really interesting things is you can do a big dose of mushrooms where you're really fucking tripping, right? And you're seeing colors that aren't there and shapes and whatever. But when you're on a smaller dose, but you're clearly altered, one of the neat experiences is you go outside and you look at a tree and you start crying because it's so beautiful. And you sit there for an hour just looking at the tree and you feel like you could look at it for eternity and never see the tree fully because it's so intricate and amazing and beautiful. And then at a certain point, you ask yourself, I've walked by this tree 1,000,000 times and never noticed it. Why is it so much more beautiful now? And you're like, the tree's not purple. It's still the same color. It still looks like the same shape. If I had to describe it, I would use the same. Why is it so much more fucking beautiful? Oh, I'm actually noticing it for the first time because I'm not so busy with this emptiness sense that is trying to go get full in agendas and thinking about people and laundry lists and whatever, that I'm actually just being present with it. And it's just actually that beautiful. And there's this neuroinhibitory function of certain brain regions that involve narrative that distracts us, where there's increased attention of consciousness in the sensory processes, where if you really get to be with your senses, which is again why Buddhists and Taoists and other techniques talk about really dropping into the senses, is because when you can have your attention really with it, the world's fucking beautiful. And when you get that, all violence, the basis for all the violence is gone.
I think that's probably one of the best ways to end this. The world is fucking beautiful.
Yeah. And arising from that sense of the beauty is the desire to protect it and to serve it and add to it. The artistic impulse is the desire to add to it, right? A lot of the humanitarian impulse is the desire to protect it and to serve it, but they all arise out of seeing it, recognizing it.
Awesome. I'm really happy we took this turn in the end and that you shared that. Daniel, I really truly appreciate your investment of time and sharing so many of your perspectives and experiences and thoughts. So yeah, very, very happy to have you. Thanks a lot.
This was really fun. And yeah, we could have talked about more things. If this ends up being interesting to the people that you share it with and we want to talk about more things in the future, we can.
I'd love that. I will share some of my favorite other pieces from you because you create content, you are on other podcasts, so that if someone is interested, you can follow down in the rabbit hole, as so have I, and there's more content to catch up on. And also besides that, is there a specific channel or way people can follow you or reach out to you in case there's some interesting synergies?
Well, as problematic and fucked up a tool as it is, I actually do post stuff on Facebook sometimes. And work there. So Facebook is actually probably the best place for stuff. I put up a blog a few years ago, civilizationemerging.com. I don't add to it very often, but there's some old stuff there.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. Again, thanks for being on the pod. And yeah, we talk soon.
Be well. Great being with you.